Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On this week's program, our final show before the 2020 elections. We look at the legacy of family separations, the decreased role of immigration on the campaign trail, and the latest legal developments. All that's just ahead. Stick around. And here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
Thanks to you both for being here, as always. All right, let's start here. In the summer of 2018, separations of migrant families arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border captured the nation's attention. Now comes news that, according to a court brief filed by the ACLU, families have still not been located for 545 children separated in 2017 during a pilot program in El Paso, Texas, that served as the foundation for those 2018 separations. It's just the latest development as voters take stock in the last days of the campaign of the Trump administration's handling of the border both before and during the pandemic. Cris, we've discussed the zero-tolerance policy before. What's the difference between that policy, which led to the 2018 separations, and this 2017 pilot program?
So, if you look at it operationally, there isn't that big of a difference in terms of what was being done. So, as to kind of refresh folks on zero tolerance, basically the policy was that the Trump administration instructed CBP to refer individuals, families that had been detained at the U.S.-Mexico border, basically send the parents to the Department of Justice for prosecution of illegal entry, which is a tiny category of crime within the Immigration and Nationality Act that they would be prosecuted for, and then eventually, either put in federal custody and then subsequently moved into the removal process, so they're deported from the United States. And it was during that process, particularly when the parents were being prosecuted, that the children were being separated, and then all of a sudden there was no real plan to basically maintain connection and contact between the parents and the children. And then obviously this led to the separation of families, and this became a major crisis in summer of 2018. Now, basically, when you look at the pilot program was actually similar. And once again, as indicated by its name, pilot program, it didn't have a formal name, but it basically was sort of the way that the administration wanted to do a trial run of how this would work in practice. It was done in El Paso. That's where it was centralized. And basically, they just wanted to see whether or not this particular strategy would deter the arrivals of families coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. And then once there was a sense that at least maybe this could have some potential deterrence effective, then they decided to say, you know what, let's expand this and let's actually implement this into a full-fledged policy. Now, the thing is, this program, nobody knew about it until you started seeing a couple developments. One of the key things was that there was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of some of the families that then was picked up by Lumi Creel, who's a journalist. She's with ProPublica now, but she was with the Houston Chronicle, and she began reporting on this, I think, long before you started getting national media attention for what would eventually become zero tolerance. So there was an acknowledgement that it existed, but it didn't get as much attention until it was really distributed across the border. And so that's, I think, the broad context of what this pilot program was, what it was intended to do, and eventually how it would eventually connect to zero tolerance, which then came online several months afterwards and then produced the results that we saw that summer.
Theresa, what did the ACLU say in this court brief, and how has the government responded?
Well, so it was a joint status report that the ACLU actually filed with the government. So Judge Dana Sabra in San Diego, who is overseeing this court case over the child separation policies, has had a requirement that there be monitors to help basically reunite the separated children with their families. And the government is required to provide assistance to basically it's the non-governmental organizations such as the ACLU and various NGO partners that are trying to connect the children. And in this latest report that was filed as of October 20th, this steering committee stated that approximately 545 children remain for whom they cannot reunite them with their parents. And there's a breakdown of that. 283 children whose parents just have not been found. They cannot locate them anywhere in their home countries or in the United States. 187 children whose parents have been found, but they haven't been able to contact them. In other words, they know they must be either in their home country, but they can't actually reach them to find out if they want to reunite. And 75 children whose parents haven't been found, but they believe they will be able to locate them via telephone. In other words, they think they have a good telephone number. They just haven't been able to connect yet. And most of these are children that were from that original pilot project that Cris talked about. So these are children who have been separated now potentially as long as 3.5 years, some of them quite young. Most of these children are no longer in government custody. They are with other family members or relatives or other adults. They've been released into the United States. So they're not currently in government custody, but they are not with their parents. And that's what the status report noted.
Theresa, I'll start with you here, but I want both of you to weigh in. What does this news tell us about the legacy of the Trump administration's border policies? How do you think we'll reflect on this looking back?
Well, I do believe this is going to be one of those points in the immigration system where there will be a lot written. There have already been books written about it, and there will be more written to date. Basically, what we know now, because of these various lawsuits and other information that has come out, is that when the government started this project in 2017 and then continued and expanded into zero tolerance in 2018, 2019, they had no plan to reunite parents and children. That was made clear by Office of Inspector General reports. That has been made clear by various press reports and by the court filings in this case. We know that thousands of children were separated from their families, and there was simply no plan to reunite them. We are now looking at still, again, over 500 children who years later now are not able to be reunited with their families, either in the United States or in their home countries. And this policy, as many may remember, was sort of the one border policy that really galvanized the country against the Trump administration. There was the kids in cages issue, which was about how children at the border were treated, but it was very much conflated with this idea of separating children from parents, both of which were deemed by the majority of the public to be just beyond the pale in terms of what they expected of their government when trying to enforce immigration law. And as much as the Trump administration tried to state that they believed they were helping families by deterring them, this policy was just not acceptable to the American public. And the legacy of this, I think, will be long lasting for this administration and for any subsequent administration in terms of how they deal with arriving children and families at the border.
Yeah, I think obviously kind of picking up a thread from Theresa, I think the legacy of this program and zero tolerance that followed it, I think certainly it was a horrible policy, and the effects were really negative for the families that went through that process. I will say that in a way, though, the fact that we're sort of still talking about the separation of families at the border has almost overshadowed the other policies that the administration has brought into place after it basically sort of shut down zero tolerance in order to deter the arrivals of families and children coming from Central America. We've talked about this over the years, the Remain in Mexico policy, where, individuals can access the asylum system, but they have to wait in Mexico for their court dates to be able to go through that process. You have the Guatemalan Asylum Cooperative Agreement that would send individuals back to Guatemala to seek asylum protection there. You've had PACER and HARP, which are expedited removal processes for asylum seekers. And most recently, you've had Title 42, which is, the CDC order that allows for rapid expulsions of individuals. And these different policies have had a range of effects on the immigrants who have gone through there, but they just never really got the attention that the family separation issues did. And I think a lot will be written about that as well, as to why this didn't really get as much attention. And my theory is always that it's a little bit easier to kind of think, well, it's not affecting the migrants that badly if it doesn't happen on U.S. soil. So I think that that's one of those issues there, is that there's that. The other thing I think is important to note is that pilot programs have an extensive history of leading to broad policy changes, and particularly pilot programs out of Texas. Operation Streamline, which is kind of the spiritual predecessor to Zero Tolerance, came out of Texas as a pilot program. Pacer and HARP, which I talked about earlier, that is also a pilot program that came out of Texas. So another thing to think about the legacy of this program is that it falls in line with a long history of CBP and DHS developing policies in Texas that are pilot programs that then may become bigger. And I think that little bit of the untold story about the legacy of pilot programs really is something that I think needs to have a lot more attention, because we always see the big policy. We don't see where they're coming from.
One last thing I might say is that there has been a concerted effort on the part of immigration advocates to fine and hold accountable administration officials who implemented and created these policies. And that has attached to former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, to former DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and others. And I think that definitely, should there be a Democratic win in the election, you might see some additional hearings trying to pull out exactly who is responsible and how for this, because it has had such a large impact, if you will, in the immigration enforcement world.
Okay, when we come back, whatever happened to immigration on the campaign trail? The presidential campaign is nearly finished, and over the last few months, commentators have observed that immigration has played a smaller role in this campaign compared with the 2016 race. For instance, immigration didn't appear as a subject for the presidential or vice presidential debates until the second and last debate between President Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden. Nevertheless, Trump has continued making immigration an issue at his rallies, suggesting that the issue hasn't completely subsided for him or his base. So, Theresa, what do you make of the role of immigration in this year's campaign?
Well, I think to those of us who follow immigration, it is notably less than 2016, even 2018, when Trump wasn't on the ballot, but he was working to try to, maintain and win seats for fellow Republicans, many of whom made immigration a key issue in their races. But of course, we know how 2018 turned out, and Democrats took back the House. And so I think that it definitely is notable that there's less of an immigration discussion on the campaign trail this year. Possibly it's due to some fallout from the 2018 elections and realizing the issue didn't have as much salience, maybe, as particularly in congressional races. But I also think it's just notable how much has happened since 2018. I think coronavirus and the economic impact of the closures that resulted from coronavirus, the race for a vaccine, and the issues over racial justice and the protests in the country have certainly taken precedence over immigration as an issue in the public discourse. Certainly, if you look at the number of minutes devoted to these issues on the major media networks, but also just on the campaign trail and in the public's mind. Immigration is still important. It is definitely more important to Republican voters than Democratic voters. Poll after poll has shown that, but it's just not as high on the agenda. So while Trump continues to mention it, he still keeps talking about how he's built the wall. It's not the issue that he is focusing on almost to the exclusiveness of anything else.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, reflecting on the campaign, is one of the things that made 2015, 2016 very interesting for individuals who've been following immigration for a while is that Trump kind of tapped into local and regional resentment against immigration. If you look at, for instance, the development of state immigration laws, you had Arizona SB 1070 that came out in 2010 and sort of various other copycat laws in areas where there was a sense of a blowback against immigration, particularly illegal immigration, and the sense that President Obama wasn't doing enough on addressing this issue, even though he had record levels of deportation. And I think what happened in 2016 is that Trump kind of successfully nationalized that resentment and that blowback, and and maybe he intentionally or he unintentionally found it and then realized it got him a lot of attention. But he essentially nationalized that type of approach to immigration in ways that I think we hadn't seen in a very, very, very long time. And that, probably accounts for part of the reason why he was able to do well with the primaries and then eventually, maybe become president. He tapped into that sentiment. I think what we're seeing right now, in 2018, he kind of continued that strategy. What I would say is that what we're seeing right now, though, is that President Trump is, of course, still talking about immigration at his rallies. And we've seen the Department of Homeland Security sort of set up billboards in Pennsylvania or about migrants who've committed crimes, or having press conferences in swing states. That I think what you're seeing is now reverse, that Trump is trying to regionalize immigration, and particularly in swing states where he thinks that could potentially allow him to gain against former Vice President Biden. So in a way, it's kind of full circle. Something that was regional became national because of Trump. But now Trump is trying to regionalize it once again. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it may not be getting as much media attention, but I think it's certainly still, immigration is still playing an important role, but I think it's far more specific this time around.
Cris, I'll stick with you. We finally heard mention of immigration in the final presidential debate, as I mentioned up top in this segment. And it was actually a fairly substantive exchange. What issues did the candidates address?
We were just talking about the last segment about that ACLU brief. And so in one of the last segments of the debate, the moderator, she asked, and it was under a segment called Families, she asked President Trump to sort of take into account the news story and to sort of talk about his reactions to the news about not being able to reunite these families. And it was interesting because, what you then saw is Vice President Biden really lean into and critique the administration for the policy and how it undermined American values and the impact that it had on families. And President Trump then pivoted and he just said, "But you built the cages, Joe. You built the cages." And that was interesting because what you saw afterwards in this exchange is people were trying to get a sense of what the reality is. And I think what I've told, reporters and other individuals after the debate was that, certainly border infrastructure that held migrant children had been built up over successive decades by successive administrations, but it's government policies that dictated who would be put into these facilities and for how long. And so in a way, the exchange was very illuminating because, Biden was critiquing the policy of zero tolerance and that, and the pilot program. But Trump was trying to pivot away and try to make it an issue about the decisions that the Obama administration made on border infrastructure. So that was interesting. But there was also a little bit of a discussion about the future of immigration and the immigration system. And Joe Biden talked about how this is a benefit and this is something that's really great. It was interesting to me that you didn't see President Trump lean in a little bit more into his discussions about merit-based systems. We've talked about this on this podcast, that there is a merit-based system that assesses an individual's background and gives them points to enter the United States. And the administration's been talking about this plan at various points since I think at least May 2019. And we've never seen it. But it would have been interesting had President Trump actually sort of pivoted and said, well, I'm trying to bring in the right immigrants to bring this. And that, could have put Joe Biden a little bit on the defensive, but he didn't go there. He mostly just kept critiquing Biden for what Obama did. The last thing I think that's fascinating when talking about what former Vice President Biden talked about, he did set out some interesting line marks. He said that if he were elected president within the first 100 days, he would actually go and legalize, the undocumented as sort of a standalone bill or part of a COVID package. That's something that progressives have been sort of advocating for in recent months, and it was interesting that he sort of stepped out and he said that, and so that was actually really interesting. And there was a sense that he was able to sort of acknowledge, though, that the Obama administration maybe didn't get it quite right in trying to get comprehensive immigration reform across the line. President Trump said, well, you're a failure, and essentially was critiquing them for not being able to do anything, which he was saying throughout the whole debate. But I think it is a little rich that President Trump was really criticizing Vice President Biden and by extension President Obama for failing to get comprehensive immigration reform done, when in fact their predecessors, Republican George W. Bush, also failed to get comprehensive immigration reform done. This is an issue that will not go away, and it has, we've had two successive administrations, President Bush and President Obama's, that didn't get immigration reform done. There's a whole lot of reasons as to why that is. But I think the key thing really is that President Trump was really trying to criticize the Obama administration, and I think it would have been interesting had President Biden actually noted the history of comprehensive immigration reform as sort of the graveyard of many policy ideas that maybe could have come into fruition but didn't for various reasons.
Theresa, our polling last year indicated that immigration was a pretty hot topic for a lot of Americans, but obviously the pandemic has upended things and people have different policy preferences. Where do you think immigration stands in the minds of voters right now? Do you want to expand on what you said earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think, interestingly enough, in 2016 and especially in 2018, we saw immigration rise to among the top three issues behind the economy and education, which are perennially top 1 and 2 for most voters. But immigration became a high third. But you also have to understand at that same time, there was a lot happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. We were in the midst of the child separation issues. We were seeing, the arrivals of hundreds of thousands of Central American families seeking asylum. It was clear that things weren't going well. That has subsided in part because, like it or not, the Trump administration has reduced the number of people arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border through the series of asylum policies that it has put in place, including Remain in Mexico, including the CDC Title 42 orders. And that has decreased the number of people at the border. Now, there are still lots of issues there. Certainly those people who have been sent back to Mexico are in the migrant camps there are facing issues. But as Cris said earlier, once it's sort of on the other side of the border for a lot of Americans, it's out of sight, out of mind. And so that is one of the major reasons why it's not there. And the polls lately, again, show immigration in the top 10, but it is far below where it was in the last two elections. And again, there's a difference in the salience between the parties. For Republicans, immigration is a motivating issue for the Republican base, so Trump will continue to talk about it. For Democrats, it's not as big an issue, even for the base. It still comes behind healthcare and a few other things. So Biden isn't necessarily advantaged by raising it either, except as to say, being against some of the policies that Trump has put in place. And I think you saw that in the debate. Trump tried to turn the proud separation back on Biden as part of Obama policy, saying they started kids in cages. They built the cages, but the separation policy was all on Trump. And, Biden talked about the 545, which was the news that had just broke the day of the debate. I think going into this last week, immigration is likely not going to be a make or break issue, no matter how this election turns out, simply because it is not the preeminent issue of the campaign. Certainly it will be on the minds of certain voters and it will be part and parcel of their overall decision. But I don't think, and however this comes out, it can necessarily be seen as a mandate on immigration. Either way, I agree with Cris that I wish there had been more in the debates, because it would have spelled out how clearly differential the policies of a Biden administration would be from a second Trump administration. But again, I don't think that however this comes out, it's necessarily a big mandate that those elected can see. Well, that's not to say that a Biden administration wouldn't try to do a lot of things. As Cris mentioned, there's a lot of pressure from the progressive immigration advocacy world, and he did promise to do so. But again, is it a huge mandate to do a lot? Not sure the election will show that.
All right, after the break, the gavel. Finally today, it's the gavel. Last month, the Supreme Court agreed to hear cases on the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy and its efforts to reprogram government funding to build a border wall. This comes after the court's decision to take up the question of excluding undocumented immigrants from being counted in the U.S. Census for determining congressional apportionment. These decisions suggest the court may have an increased role in shaping immigration in the future. Theresa, walk me through the context around these cases and the court's decision to take them up.
Sure. So beginning of October, the new session for the Supreme Court, they look at all of the people who have filed appeals and decide which cases they're going to take. It takes a majority of the justices to agree to take up a case on appeal. Not every appeal to the Supreme Court is heard. These cases reflect cases that had been pending, in some cases had been to the Supreme Court previously in deciding whether or not to keep or remove injunctions that had been put in place by lower courts, but it's back now. So, for example, the Remain in Mexico or migration protection protocols, the Supreme Court previously overruled a lower court injunction against the policies, which let them proceed since 2019. The court now agreed to hear an appeal on the underlying case, which had finally been decided by the lower court against the government. So the government appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, okay, we will hear this case. The case against the border wall, filed by the Sierra Club and a few other organizations, is about whether or not President Trump had the authority and legally diverted money from the Defense Department budget to DHS to build the wall funding. This has, again, been an ongoing series of litigations with different lower court injunctions stopping and then starting. This would allow the Supreme Court to finally rule on that issue. And then lastly, the apportionment case had just been at the Supreme Court a couple of weeks prior when they agreed to that there was a temporary injunction on that. Now the Supreme Court is going to look at it and say finally whether or not President Trump would be allowed to require the Census Department to not count undocumented immigrants in the memorandum it sends about apportionment following this census. The three of these cases taken together have pretty significant impacts for immigration writ large. Certainly Remain in Mexico as one of the policies that was put in place by the Trump administration to initially deal with asylum seekers at the border, was one that was arguably outside the scope of immigration law. That was one of the key findings. And literally just yesterday, there was a new case filed in California against the migration protection protocols on differing grounds than what we're going to see in the Supreme Court. The border wall funding, there's a lot of background to that, but a lot of it has to do with, again, how broad authority does the president have to declare an emergency, to do things with money that Congress hasn't authorized him to do by declaring such an emergency, and frankly, was there an emergency to build the wall? The apportionment case probably has the biggest immediate impact. As we all know, there have been a lot of fights about the census, the 2020 census over the last couple of years, including whether or not to ask a citizenship question, and the Supreme Court denied that, so went against the administration on that. Now the president is trying to say that undocumented immigrants should not be counted as residents of the states for purposes of deciding how many representatives in the House of Representatives a state might have. This would have impacts to both Republican and Democratic states, frankly, should it go into effect. And because of the urgency of this, because this memorandum and apportionment is supposed to start shortly after a new Congress is sworn in next year, the court is expediting the hearing on that. So they'll be hearing that case November 30th of this year. The other two cases won't be heard until 2021, meaning that the outcome of the election will probably determine what happens with those two cases. Should Vice President Biden be elected, whether or not his administration would continue to defend those policies in front of the Supreme Court is an open question.
Cris, what do you see as the court's role in shaping immigration policy moving forward? Is the experience of the last 4 years an anomaly, or are we likely to see continued litigation even in a potential Biden administration next year and beyond?
I think what we're going to see is that the court's going to become increasingly more prominent in shaping immigration policy. We talked about this a little bit in one of our past episodes in the recent past about the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, and the sense that, the Supreme Court for a very long time, really when it came to immigration, really was looking at more technical issues around removals or immigration benefits, if they took up those cases at all. It's very technical and very technocratic. It really didn't add as broad, big questions around immigration policy and what the government can't do, whether that's the federal government, the executive branch, or state governments. But that's increasingly becoming, I think, a clear part of the court's jurisprudence. And I think the fact that the courts picked up these cases, I think, directly, we sort of foreshadowed that in one of these past episodes, and now we're beginning to see it actually happen. And that is, I think, is going to be very significant, because when you're looking now at actual concrete policies that the court's going to be setting precedent for, one of them is going to be on border policy. This is going to be a big issue. Can you actually utilize what Theresa has called in the past sort of an interesting little loophole in the law, that basically the way the law that was used that led to MPP was actually used at the U.S.-Canadian border for individuals who are awaiting removal proceedings, who are Canadians, who are in the Canadian side, and then can go into the United States and deal with their immigration cases. That was sort of where the law, that how it was used. The way that the administration used it was, completely inverse in some ways of what the purpose was. But the question is, how can the administration actually use this and use it to this effect? That's going to be huge. That's going to be setting a really big precedent when it comes down to what a government can do when it comes to dealing with asylum seekers. Same thing with setting aside wall funding and the ways that you have to balance the different branches and what can't be done to be able to fund that. I think that's also going to be an important issue, especially as issues around DHS funding, I think, will continue to be very politicized, even in the Biden administration, when you see Democrats that are increasingly wary about the agency's role during the Trump administration. And they're going to want some more restrictions on funding. That question may always come up in the future. And then finally, the census. I mean, we've talked about this a bit. Obviously, who you count is going to be really important for determining benefits and for political representation. But it also is a broader question of really who's almost being counted as an American in a way, who's being counted as a community. So I think there's an ethical question that has to be addressed there alongside the legal one. Taken as a whole, I think we're now beginning to really see where the court's going to be shaping policies. And I think as we see more litigation from the Trump era against the administration's policies going through the federal courts, I think we're going to see this coming up. But the question, of course, is, and we're recording this the week before the election, and our listeners will probably be hearing it the week of. But if there's a case that former Vice President Biden wins, whether his administration will continue trying to defend these policies in the federal court system, and that could be potentially an issue where they may not try to defend it as much and maybe won't set the precedent. But right now, we're very much looking at a situation where the Supreme Court is now beginning to set moves for what it wants to do on immigration policy, and that will have major that will have major reverberations in the immigration policy space.
One last thing I would just add a coda to that. Many of these cases include lower courts that issued nationwide injunctions against the policies, and previous Supreme Court decisions from some of the more conservative members of the court, including dissents and concurring opinions, have raise the specter of looking for a case in which the court can rule on whether or not lower courts actually have the authority to issue such nationwide injunctions. There is a significant feeling by many of the conservative judiciary that it's overreach for a district court or a circuit court of appeals to issue such injunctions. And so these cases could be ones, now that there is a conservative majority on the court, that would rule on that. And that would have implications beyond just immigration. It would have implications to any time litigation is used to try to put a stop to a national policy that people don't like.
All right, that's a good place to leave it for today. Theresa, Cris, thanks as always for joining me. And a special farewell to Cris, who's leaving us this week. Cris, wishing you all the best on your next adventures.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you, Cris, so much for being part of This Week in Immigration for all these years. You will be sorely missed.
It's been a real pleasure and honor working with you guys, and I hope all the listeners at home that this has been informative. This podcast, we made it just for you, and we've been here just trying to give you a little bit of sanity and rationality in a very polarized time around a very polarized issue. You'll hear from me in other ways, but if you don't hear me in this podcast, hopefully you'll find me in other ways, and we'll just go from there. So good night and good luck.
No better way to say it. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite platform. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Cris, Ramón, and myself. Our producers are Cris, Ramón, and Yafat Tawahada, and our editor is Yafat Tawahada. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. I'm Jordan LaPier. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.